All right, Erev Tov, good evening, welcome back. Today we continue um, Maimonides' introduction to Perek Helek, which deals with the ultimate reward. And the part we are starting today, and I already warned you about this last week, today's class is going to be, it's a heavy topic. We're starting the 13 Ikarim, the famous 13 fundamental principles of Judaism as formulated by Maimonides. With the 13 fundamental principles that we know of Judaism is this formulation of Maimonides. It's been incorporated into the tefillah. At the end, there's a little piyut, a nice song that we sing, whether it be Yigdal or Adon Olam. And so today we're going to start the first batch of some of these 13 Ikarim. All right. Some of them, basically, what we're going to be studying today, we dedicated a few classes to it in one of the previous courses on the fundamentals of Judaism. There's a few chapters. Here, these few chapters are going to be in a few of these Ikarim, which we are going to discuss, not as in depth as we did in the previous course. If you want to go deeper, please refer back to that previous course. But we will try to understand as much as we can today. And basically, today we're setting the foundation of what is monotheism. What does it mean to believe in God or to believe in one God? All right. The next Ikarim that we'll study has to do with Nevuah and Torah min Hashamayim, right? Prophecy and divine revelation and Torah coming down. That's more what it means to be Jewish. Now it's what it means to believe in God and what it means to believe in one God. So the 13 Ikarim, Hayesod Harishon, the first Ikar, Metziut HaBorei Barach, is the existence of God, or existence of the Creator. Vehu, sheyesh sham nimtza shalem bechol darkei hamesiut. Says, and that there is this entity, this being that is a whole, perfect, complete being in reality. Vehu illat metziut hanimtzaim kulam. And this being is the primary cause of all of reality. Bo kiyum metziutam umimenu kiyumam. Right? Everything is derived. Everyone derives their reality from this primary being, this primary cause. And in a different translation, this originally was written in Arabic, right? A different translation is that they actually pull their existence from God. We've spoken in the past of this concept called this overflow of life, this overflow of love, this overflow of reality that comes, that God emits or emanates from God, right? So everything else derives their reality from this primary cause. And if anybody would try to think that there is no primary reality, that he doesn't exist, so the reality of everything else will be void, can't possibly exist. Because there will be no being that brings everything else into existence. All right, we're gonna go back to the beginning of the Mishneh Torah from our previous course. It says, Yesod HaYesodot. This is the first halacha in Maimonides' legal book. The first halacha, Yesod HaYesodot ve'amud HaChochmot lid'a sheyesh sham masui rishon. Says the most fundamental principle and the pillar of all wisdom is to acknowledge, to understand, to know that there is this primary being. All right, why is it what does this mean, this primary being? You say Bereshit, bara Elohim et hashamayim et haaretz. At the beginning, which isn't really a proper translation of Bereshit, primarily, the primary cause. What is the meaning of a primary cause? Well, let's take a rainbow, for instance, right? Any phenomenon you take in the world, we'll take a rainbow. What's the cause of the rainbow? What causes the rainbow? Well, you say, okay, it's the effect of something, the rainbow. What caused it? You say it's the sun rays in, diffracting in the water particles in the air. Well, what's causing this diffraction of the light rays into different electromagnetic waves? Oh, it says, well, it's because it's made up of different electromagnetic waves, and each one has a different frequency to it, and it interacts differently with the water. So each one bends slightly differently, and then you have this refraction of the light. It says, okay, well, where does these electromagnetic waves come from? Well, it comes from the sun. Why is the sun emitting these electromagnetic waves? It says it's radiating at a very, very hot temperature. That's why. So, well, why is it radiating at such a high temperature? Right? So we're going cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect. So what's the cause of this radiation? This is high temperature. What's the cause of that high temperature? We say, well, it's the immense gravitational force of the sun, because it has this huge mass that it's condensing everything to the center, and it's getting really hot, and it causes fusion, and it causes radiation. All right, well, what's the cause of this gravitational pull? It says, oh, well, that's one of the four fundamental forces that separated at the moment of the Big Bang. Well, what's the cause of that separation of the four fundamental forces? It says, well, that was the moment of creation. Okay, well, what was the cause of that moment of creation? That's the primary cause. That's something from outside this whole chain of causality, this primary cause. It's something that's created the universe, something that's external to it. So the pillar of all wisdom and the most fundamental understanding there is that there is this primary cause, because this investigation of the chain of causality that we did from the rainbow, you can apply that same method to any phenomenon on earth or any phenomenon in reality. So lid'a sheyesh sham masui rishon, to know that there is this primary being, vehu mamsi kol hanimsa, and you would think it would say vehu himsi kol hanimsa, and he created all of reality. It says no, vehu mamsi kol hanimsa, he creates all of reality. What does that mean, he creates? What's the difference between creates and created? It says no, God didn't create the world sometime in the past. It's not like a carpenter who constructs a nice table, right? He makes a table. There is no connection anymore between the carpenter and the table. He sold it in his shop to someone else. Someone burns the table, has no effect on the carpenter. The carpenter dies of old age, no effect on the table. There is no connection between them. He says no, but with God, it's different. It's not like someone who created something and got rid of it. It's like, think of it as a thought in your imagination, in your head. As long as you're focused on it, it exists. You get distracted, that's it, it's gone. It says, God is the one that holds reality in place, that makes it real. He holds things in existence. If he's not actively holding it in existence, it doesn't exist. וכל הנמצאים, and everything in reality, מן שמיים וארץ, ומה ביניהם, right, whether it's in the heavens or the earth or anything in between. What exactly does that mean? You'll have to go back to the previous course. לא נמצאו אלא מאמיתת הימצאו. Their existence is derived, they exist only because of his existence, because he holds them in place. And this is like word for word, practically what we read over there. And if you would think that he does not exist, nothing else could possibly exist. And if you would think that not everything exists from him, in reality, he is the only thing that actually exists, right? Because here Maimonides goes into this concept of relative existence. All right, so think of it, you're reading a book. Let's say you're reading Harry Potter. All right, does Harry Potter exist? Well, you know, when you're reading Harry Potter and you're in this, you have this fictional world in your mind, right? These characters are, to themselves, they're real. If Draco Malfoy slaps Harry Potter, he's gonna feel it and it's gonna hurt. But is he real? He says, well, that's a relative question. Relative to you, he's fiction. Harry Potter, relative to Ron and to Hermione, is real. So God is on a different level of existence. We are real to each other. But it is as if we're just like an imagination, so to speak, of God. So it says, he's the only thing that really exists. His reality is the only absolute reality. Everything else is a relative reality. Everything in reality is dependent upon him. God is not dependent on anything. God isn't affected by anything. Everything is dependent on God. It says, Lefichach, therefore, en amitato ka'amitat ahad mehem. Therefore, his reality, his truth, is ultimate, is absolute, unlike everything else. It says, Hu shanavi omer. This is what the prophet says. V'Adonai Elohim emet. It says, God, our Lord, is truth. What does that mean, is truth? Hu levado ha'emet. He is the only thing that is absolutely true. Ve'en le'acher emet ka'amito. And nothing else is real, is true on that level. V'hu sha'Torah omeret. And this is what the Torah says. En od min levado. There is nothing else other than him. What does that mean, nothing else other than him? How about us? Klomar, meaning en sham masui emet min levado kemoto. There's nothing else in existence, in reality, that is on that level of reality, that is actually, truly exists. All right, so let's go back here. So Yesod Harishon, this first fundamental principle is the existence of God. We got a little bit into a different also the Kadmut and we got into others because they're a little bit mixed into each other. They're all like one topic. That there is something out there, there's real, that everything else derives their reality from, right? Right? Everything derives their reality from him, right? Right? It's almost exactly the same wording as the halakha here. נתבטלה מציאות כל הנמצאים, everything else would be annulled, right? וכל מה שזולתו מן השכלים, and everything else in existence other than God, whether they be the angels, the pure intellects, רצוני לומר המלאכים, the angels, וגופי הגלגלים, and the stars, right? And the spheres, וכל מה שיש בתוכם, and anything that's in existence, and anything below them in existence. All right, we're not going to get into that here. Everything is dependent on his existence. Not that he existed once, that he exists. Nothing else can exist without him existing and making them exist. וזה היסוד הראשון. And this first fundamental principle, מורה עליו דיבור, אנוכי אדוני אלוהיך. Says this is, over here he actually puts it down as a mitzvah, vidi'ah דבר זה, מצוות עשה, and acknowledging this is a positive mitzvah, שנאמר, אנוכי אדוני אלוהיך, I am God your Lord, is to acknowledge his existence, וכל המעלה על דעתו שיש שם אלוה אחר חוץ מזה, and everyone who wants to think that there is this other primary being, this other cause, this other God other than him, עובר בלא תעשה, right? He is transgressing a negative mitzvah, שנאמר, as it says, לא יהיה לך אלוהים אחרים על פניי. You should have no other God in my place, in my presence. Really what it also means is, this is the isur also of avodah zarah, of relying on some other authority other than God. The kafar ba'ikar, right? And he rejected the ikar, the yesod of the yesodot, the foundation of all foundations. שזה העיקר הגדול שהכל תלוי בו. Right? This is the fundamental principle that everything is dependent on. What does it mean everything is dependent? Well, the entire Torah is dependent on God's existence. There is no Torah without prophecy. There is no prophecy without revelation from God. There is no revelation, right, without God. Everything is dependent on it. But everything, not just the Torah, is dependent on it. It's not just the foundation that all other of the 13, the other 12 foundations, fundamental principles are dependent on. All of reality is dependent on God's existence. All right, so that's the first yesod, the first fundamental principle. And the second, yesod hasheni, yichud Hashem yitbarach, is the oneness, the unity of God. And before we explain that, we'll also say what the third principle is. The third principle is shlilat hagashmut mimenu, the incorporeality of God, that God has no physical form. And these two are actually very strongly connected. All right? We're going to see that also in the halakha soon. So what does this mean, yihud? That God is one. כלומר, שהוא סיבת הכל אחד. This primary being, the primary cause, the cause of all reality, is one. And we'll see that this one isn't a real one. What does that even mean? ואינו כאחד הזוג ולא כאחד המין. Right? It's not one as in a pair where there's two and there's one out of that. ולא כאחד המין, and not like a species. Okay, so it's actually, I think his Hebrew version over here is even better. Eloah ze echad hu, right? This God, this primary being, is one. Eino lo shenayim velo yater al shenayim. Right? There is no multiplicity in it. There's no two of them, and there's no more than two of them. Ela echad, only one. She'en ki yihudo echad min ha'ahadim hanimsa'im ba'olam. This unity of God is not comparable to any other unity that we may know in our reality. So even unity, even one, is a relative term. And nothing can compare to the oneness of this primary being, this primary cause. It says, Lo ehad kimin shu kolel ahadim harbe. It's not one like a species, which within the species there's many individuals, right? We say, right, Mika, he said, Goy ehad ba'aris, right? Who is like your nation, Israel? Goy ehad ba'aris, one nation on the earth, right? There are many nations, right? There's a whole animal kingdom, and there's a species, right? There's a human race, which is special. It's one. It's separate from all the others. And within that human race, there are different nations. There's the Jewish nation. It's unique. It's special, right? Goy had ba'aris. But it includes many individuals. There's me and you, right? There's many different individuals. So it's one relative to all the species. And I am one relative to the nation. There's one nation, but it includes me and you. We're two different individuals. Right? Says, no, God is not that kind of one. It's not a mathematical one. There is no multiplicity. Right? There's this ancient Mesopotamian myth of creation. How was the world created? There were two gods, or there were many gods, and they fought each other. And there were two left, right? Tiamat and Marduk. The two gods that would fought each other. Marduk defeated Tiamat, killed her, and took Tiamat's body, and from Tiamat's body created the earth. All right? So how many gods are there? Well, there's one left. Marduk. But there's 2 minus 1 equals 1. With us, our oneness it's not a number. It's not a mathematical oneness. We'll see exactly what that means. So even if we go into the species, we take one individual. This one individual is one. There is no other individual like him. No, but he has a physical form. This physical form can be divided into different parts. There's the head, there are the legs, there are the arms. נחלק למחלקות ולקצוות. אלא ייחוד שאין ייחוד אחר כמותו בעולם. He is a oneness that there is no comparable oneness, unity, uniqueness to it in existence. Even his oneness is beyond this reality. In order to really understand that, we also have to understand this next yesod, but before that, all right? ולא אחד כמין, ולא כאיש אחד המורכב שהוא נחלק לאחדים הרבה, not like a person that can be divided up into different parts, ולא אחד כגוף, הפשוט האחד במניין, שמקבל החינוך והפרידה לאינסוף, that can be divided unto infinity, אבל הוא יתעלה, but he, God, אחד באחדות שאין כמותה אחדות בשום פנים. There is no other kind of unity like the unity of God. וזה היסוד השני, and this second fundamental principle, we learn this from the pasuk, מה שנאמר, שמע ישראל, hear O Israel, אדוני אלוהינו, אדוני אחד. Right? God, our Lord, God is one. והיסוד השלישי, and the third fundamental principle, שלילת הגשמות ממנו, that there is no physical form to God. We could already see this a bit from the previous where we say, well, man is one compared to the species or compared to the nation, right? However, he can be divided further into different parts, and those parts could also be divided into parts into infinity. So to really be one, you can't be divisible. You can't have any physical form. וזהו כי האחד הזה אינו גוף ולא כוח בגוף. Says this one being does not have a physical form, and his force, his energy coming from him is not coming from a physical source. It's not a physical force. ולא ישיגהו מאורעות הגופים כמו התנועה והמשכן. Right? And so anything that's associated with physical form cannot be associated to God, such as tnu'ah and mishkan, right? Movement and rest. לא מצד העצמות ולא במקרה, not intrinsically and not descriptively. I mean, there is no physical description of God. ולכן שללו ממנו החכמים זיכרונם לברכה החיבור והפירוד. And therefore, the Chachamim discarded any concept of addition or connection and separation from God. ואמרו, and they said, אין למעלה לא ישיבה ולא עמידה. They said, up there. What does that mean, up there? It means in the non-physical world, the world beyond our physical world, אין למעלה, there is no ישיבה ולא עמידה, no standing and no sitting, no עורף ולא איפוי, no addition and no subtraction, כלומר לא פירוד, הוא עורף, no separation, which is the word עורף, ולא חיבור, והוא איפוי, he's explaining the words, עורף and איפוי in ancient Hebrew, מלשון, ואף הוא בכתף פלישתים, כלומר, ידחפו אותם בכתף להתחברם בהם. Proving from the pasuk, right, that they went on with the Pelishtim, that they were connected together. All right? Says, okay, ואילו היו אלוהות הרבה, היו גופין וגביות. So we said that God is united, is one. There is one God and there's no multiplicity in God. He says, if there was multiplicity in God, or if there was more than one God, then surely hayu gufin ugviyot, then they would have to be in a physical form. Why? It says, mipnei she'en hanimnin hashavin b'msiutan nifradin ze mize ela b'meora'im she'yira'u hagufot v'hagviyot. All right, this is a very difficult sentence in the Mishneh Torah. It says, what does it mean? Mipnei she'en hanimnin. It says, because anything that you can number, count, 1, 2, 3, 4, ashavin b'mtziutan, anything that is multiple, that there's a couple of, that exist in the same plane of existence, they can only be differentiated one from another. נפרדים זה מזה, אלא במאורעים שיראו הגופות והגוויות. Only by physical events and description. All right? What does that mean? Let's take a plane. Right? We have the x-axis, right? The table goes from x0 to 100. All right. If there's more, let's say there's 2 books on the table, right? Every thing, every event, it's called an event in science and physics, is defined by certain coordinates. X, where it is on the x-axis, on the y-axis, on the z-axis, x, y, z, those are spatial coordinates, and t, where it exists or when it exists in time. All right, so we're taking this plane. Let's just reduce it down to x, all at the same time. 2 books on the table. How do you differentiate between them? Well, one of them is from x0 to x10, and the other one's from x10 to x20, right? These are, it's called an irua, also in modern scientific Hebrew, same as in English, an event. It's a physical event. X, Y, Z, T, those are the coordinates. So it says, if there was more than one, they would have to be in physical form. Why? Because the only way to differentiate between them is through these coordinates. Where it is in X, where it is on Y, where it is in Z, and where it is on T. So you could have 2 books in the same place, occupying the same space, but at different times. You could have 2 books that exist in the same time in different places, right? But you can't have them there together at the same time at the same place. And how do we know that God is not defined by these physical dimensions? It says, "Ve'inu haya hayoser guf ugviyah," and if he was in physical form, haya lo kes v'tachnit, then he would have a beginning and he would have an end. Right? It would be from x0 to 1,000,000 or 1,000,000,000 or whatever. He would have a beginning, he would have an end. Because he can't be a physical form that is infinite, that has no end. וכל שיש לו כס ותכלית, יש לכוחו כס וסוף. In anything that has a beginning and an end, his force, his energy also has a limit to it, has an end. So we know all of mass, all matter in the universe has energy in it, right? E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass multiplied by the square speed of light squared. That's the energy in something. And this, so it has energy in it. And let's say you take a table, right? You take a table and you push down on the table, you apply force to the table will apply force back at you. It's called resistance, right? However, the table, having a physical form, has a certain amount of energy in it, can apply only a certain amount of force back at you. Eventually, if you apply too much force, it'll break. So if God was restricted by a physical form, no matter how great this physical form is, the force that he would have would also be limited. It would be finite. It wouldn't be infinite. Ve'elohenu baruch shemo. However, our God, blessed be He, ho'in ve'koho en lokes ve'eno posek, says God's force is infinite. We see this. We'll explain soon. And it doesn't end ever. There is no end to this force. How do we know? Shaharei hagalgal sovev tamid. It says because the universe is always in motion, right? You have the earth orbiting the sun orbiting the galaxy orbiting constellations of galaxies, right? That's on the macro level. You go down to the micro level. You have the atoms. You have the electrons orbiting the nucleus. Everything is always in motion, and all this motion requires energy, and all this energy, because it's constantly in motion, and it's how do you call it? It's revolving. It's an infinite motion, and it's an infinite energy. And it has to come from an infinite source. And if it comes from an infinite source, that source cannot be physical, cannot be restricted by physical boundaries. And if it's not restricted by physical boundaries, it has no physical form, right? En koho, koach guf, it has no physical form. Ve'ho'in ve'eno guf. So therefore, it can't be of a physical source. And since it has no physical form, it can't be separated and divided. Lo yir'o me'orot ha'gufot, k'dei she'nichlak ve'nifrad me'aher. Then you can't apply any physical criteria to it, any description to physical description to it. No adding, no subtracting, no dividing, no separating it from something else. Lefichach, therefore, אפשר שיהיה אלא אחד. Therefore, it can only be one. So what does this mean? That it is one? Really, if you want to think of one in terms that we know, God isn't even that. We say he's one for lack of a better word. And really what Maimonides says is shelilat hagashmut is subtracting or negating any description, adjectives, anything you think about, right? You say God is great, God is big, Atayl Kabir, you are a great God. What does that mean, big? El Gadol Venora. Well, it's a descriptive term. And the Chachamim, they're actually mad at someone who tried to add descriptions to God. It says, if you really want to understand God, you can't understand him through positive descriptions. You need to understand that these descriptions don't apply to God. Big insinuates size, which insinuates physical form, which doesn't apply to God. So even one doesn't really apply to God. It insinuates numbers, multiplicity, addition, subtraction. You can get to one by subtracting one from two, or by subtracting two from three. It's not a real one, it's a mathematical one. God is one, or we call him one, because there is nothing else that we can describe him as. It's for lack of a better word, we say one. V'yidiat davar zeh mizvat aseh, and knowing this is a positive mitzvah, what we said before, shneimar, says Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Right, God our Lord, God is one. Okay? So, היסוד השלישי, שלילת הגשמות, says, is that there is no physical form to God. If God had physical form, then he wouldn't be one. ואמר הנביא ואל תדמיון אל. Right, and the prophet says, who can you compare to God? ואל תדמיוני ואשווה, יאמר הקדוש. Right, God says, who will you compare me to and make some sort of, sorry, what's the word? Some sort of comparison with me. It says, ואילו היה גוף, היה דומה לגופים. And if he was in a physical form, any physical entity can be described using an event on the XYZT axis. And if God had a physical form, you just use those measurements, just a million times bigger, a trillion times bigger, right? But all these things don't really apply to him because he has no physical form. So you can't compare him to anything. וכל מה שבא בכתבי הקודש שמתארים אותו בתארי הגופות, כמו ההליכה והעמידה, and anything that's in scripture that describes God using physical forms, such as God going, God standing, hayeshiva, hadibur, God speaking. God can't speak because he has no vocal cords, he can't make sound the way we make sound, right? He doesn't sit, he doesn't stand. Right? And all of these things, hakol derech hashana, these are all allegories. They're borrowed terms from terms that we know, that we understand, and we project onto God. Not that he really does any of these things. This is what the Chachamim say, Dibera Torah kilshon b'nei Adam. The Torah spoke in the language of man. Man understands speech. Man understands motion through flying, through walking, through running. And so God was described in these ways. Not that any of these descriptions actually apply to God. The Chachamim mentioned this many, many times. והיסוד השלישי הזה מורה עליו מה שנאמר כי לא ראיתם כל תמונה. In this third fundamental principle of Judaism, that God has no physical form, right, is we can learn this from the pasuk that you have not seen any image. לא ראיתם כל תמונה, you didn't see any image. כלומר, לא השגתם אותו בעל תמונה לפי שהוא, right, when you perceived me in Mount Sinai, you did not perceive any physical form. כמו שזכרנו, אינו גוף ולא כוח בגוף. Right? He is not a physical form, and his force, his energy, is not physical either. והיסוד הרביעי, and the fourth fundamental principle, hakadmut, right? That he is primary, that he is first. And even that is not really a good description. It's not a good term. Vehu, and what does this mean? Kadmut, ki zeh ha'echad, this one primary being that has no physical form, ha'amur, that we spoke about, hu kadmon be'echlet. He is the absolute primary, first, beginning. וכל נמצא זולתו בלתי קדמון בערכו אליו, and everything else in existence is not primary compared to him. Again, there's a relative, even one or first is a relative term. You can be first in line, you can be the first in your family to do something, you can be the oldest person and you were born first, right? You can be the first to think of something, but these are all relative first. There's only one first, the primary being, which is the primary cause, what caused everything to exist to begin with. והראיות על זה בכתבי הקודש רבות, and there are many pesukim in scripture talking about God being first. והיסוד הרביעי הזה, and this fourth fundamental principle is, we can learn this from the pasuk שנאמר מעונה אלוהי קדם, right? God, the primary or the primordial God, the first to exist, מעונה אלוהי קדם. וידע כי היסוד היותר גדול של תורת משה רבנו להיות העונה מחודש, and you should know that one of the primary fundamental concepts of the Torah is that the world was created. There's a big discussion among philosophers, did the universe exist eternally, always, or did it have a beginning point? And the Torah starts off by telling us the world has a beginning. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim et haaretz, right? This primary being, this primary cause, bara et hashamayim et haaretz, created the heavens and the earth. הוא היות העולם מחודש, that the world was created. המציאו השם וברעו אחר ההיעדר הגמור. Right? That this universe was created with nothing existing prior to it. It didn't evolve from something before it. It was brought into existence by this primary being, and there was nothing prior to it for it to evolve from. This is called Ha'eder HaGamur, Ha'eder HaMukhlat, which is called the Ayin, the absolute nothing. Or in philosophical terms, they call it creation ex nihilo. וזה שתראני סובב סביב עניין קדמותו על דעת הפילוסופים. Says in this that you'll see me many times building these whole philosophical ideas built on this idea of the world existing eternally, as the philosophers say, the Greek philosophers say, this is, I'm only assuming their principles in order to prove, even using their logic, that God's existence is absolute and eternal and primary. And by the way, by so doing, he's also proving, by adopting their fundamental principles, and can also prove that their fundamental principles are wrong and that the universe does have a beginning. As I've already explained in the More, this is a later addition into the commentary to the Mishnah, because his book, the More, the Guide for the Perplexed, was written much, much later. This is one of his first works, his commentary to the Mishnah. Any questions so far? All right, so I'm going to move on to the next, the fifth fundamental principle, the last one for today, and summarize. All right, and the fifth fundamental principle, right, that this primary being is the only one who we should be worshiping and glorifying. Or to glorify, to say how great he is, and to comply, to abide by his commandments, his mitzvot. And we should not worship any other entity that is below God in reality. Right? Not the angelic beings, not the celestial beings, not the elements, and not anything that was created by the elements, meaning any physical matter, or any person, or any idea, or any angel. Right? Because everything in reality, they have a certain nature to them. Says the word that we use for nature in Hebrew is teva. Teva actually comes from the word like a ring, tabat, or a stamp, meaning they were stamped by God how to behave. They were encoded. God programmed them to behave in a certain way. So even the angels and the celestial beings, right, they behave in accordance to God's programming. And so there's no reason to worship and glorify them, to glorify the one who programmed them. Because they have no law of their own, and they have no choice, freedom of choice of their own, and any freedom of choice that anyone else has was programmed as a freedom of choice, as if this, then that, if this, then that, right? So the only one who has absolute freedom and freedom of choice is God himself. And therefore, he's the only one that we should be praying to, the only one that we should be worshiping, the only one whose laws we should be following, because those laws are his programming for us. Those laws come from absolute freedom. וכן אין ראוי לעובדם כדי להיותם אמצעים לקרבה אליו. And so too we should not worship them as intermediary beings to get to God. So not to go directly to God. אלא אליו בלבד יכוונו המחשבות. Our thoughts and our prayers and our actions should be directed directly to God. ויניחו כל מה שזולתו. And forget about anything else that's not him. וזה היסוד החמישי הוא שהזהיר על עבודת אלילים. Says, and this fifth fundamental principle is the isur, the transgression of avodah zarah, pagan worship. ורוב התורה מזהרת עליה. And most of the Torah is there to prevent us from worshiping, from practicing any kind of pagan practices. This is so, to the point as the Chachamim go as far as saying that anybody who rejects paganism, anyone says, Kol hakofer ba'avodah zarah, anybody who rejects paganism, ke'ilnu kiyem et kol haTorah kula. It's as if he fulfilled the entire Torah. Meaning the Torah is coming to direct us away from pagan thought, from pagan behavior. And so even if, I don't know, you've never encountered a Jew in your life, you have no idea, but you manage to reject paganism, it's as if you performed all the mitzvot in the Torah. Ke'ilu kiyem et kol haTorah kula. All right, let's go back here. Where do we see this over here? It says, Hamatzui hazeh hu Elohei ha'olam adon kol ha'aris. We said there's relative reality and there's God's absolute reality. So there's relative truth and there's absolute truth. It says, this primary being, Hamasui hazehu Elohei ha'olam Adon kol ha'aris. He is the Lord of the world, Adon, the master of the universe. It's two different things. Elohei ha'olam, right? Eloah, we use the word Eloah as God. The Hebrew word Eloah actually means supreme authority. All right? V'yitem ke'Elohim yodei tov vara, and you shall be as Elohim that can differentiate good from evil. What does the Targum say there? You shall be like the political leaders. Right? It says, it says, when the sons of the Elohim, right, they saw the women that they were great. They took women for themselves. What's it talking about? Bnei Elohim. What does Rashi say? Says the princes, Bnei Elohim. Who's the Elohim? Those are the leaders, the supreme leaders with the supreme authority. Bnei Elohim are their sons. They were corrupt. They grew up on all this power and they took whatever they wanted for themselves. So this primary being, he is the ultimate authority of humanity. Eloah ha'olam. Adon, he is the master, kol ha'aris, of the physical universe. Right? As we said before, why don't we worship angels? Why are they not worthy of worship? Because everything they do is just following the script that God scripted for them, the program that God made for them. והוא המנהיג הגלגל בכוח שאין לו כס ותכלית, בכוח שאין לו הפסק, שהגלגל סובב תמיד. All right? Where's what I wanted to bring here? All right, so we said acknowledging this existence of God is a misvat aseh of Anochi Adonai Elohecha. I, God, am your Elohecha, and your Lord, and your supreme authority. And if you were to think that there's some sort of supreme authority other than God, you transgress the negative misvah of lo yeh lecha elohim achirim al panai, right? You shall have no other God slash supreme authority in my presence. How do you transgress that? Is by following some sort of, I don't know, some sort of law that contradicts God's law, by worshiping some other entity other than God. All that is lo yelecha Elohim achirim al panai, because God is the ultimate truth, ultimate reality, and the ultimate supreme authority for us. That's the meaning of Anochi Adonai Elohecha. I, Adonai is the name of God. It's like me saying, I, Sammy, am your friend. Right? Anochi Adonai, so saying me, Adonai Elohecha, your supreme authority. That's the misvah. And if you put authority in something else over God, that's lo yelecha Elohim achirim al panai, and that is the isur of avodah zarah. He says v'kafar ba'ikar. He says, and if you put authority into something else other than God, you're rejecting the primary principle, most fundamental principle, that God's supreme authority is the most fundamental principle of the Torah. He says, and you're also denying the foundation of all of reality, because you're saying, well, God's authority isn't absolute, and therefore the truth isn't absolute, because God's reality isn't absolute. And if God's reality isn't absolute, then there is no absolute reality. And if there is no absolute reality, there's no absolute reality that can bring our reality into existence. It's like saying that there is no reality. Nothing is real. Nothing is true. So even this acknowledging that God is the supreme authority is how we practice in our actions that God exists. And this goes back to the first of the primary, the first fundamental principle is God's existence. So how do we bring it into action? Is by following the misvot of the Torah, even when there is some sort of external threat trying to prevent us from following the misvot of the Torah, which I think is very fitting to end here, so close to Hanukkah, right? What is the story of Hanukkah? And those of you who will be at the Shabbat will discuss a lot more in depth. The story of Hanukkah is some sort of empire external to ours trying to force us to cancel the misvot, to not follow the misvot of the Torah. And we say, no, there is a primary authority and it's greater than the emperor of the biggest empire in the world. And we're gonna fight you on it, and we will win. And that's it for today. Okay, so what are the first batch of these fundamental principles of Judaism, or really fundamental principles of monotheism? We'll get into Judaism already in our next class. Is one, the existence of God, which is the primary being, the primary existence that brings everything else into existence, that this primary being is one, is unique, nothing else can be compared to it, and this is also because he has no physical form, which makes him absolute one. And that's the third principle, that he has no physical form. And since he has no physical form as well, he is not limited by space, nor is he limited by time, which is also a physical construct, which makes him primary in every possible way, makes him absolute reality in every possible way, absolute truth. And from there we derive also his absolute authority, and we follow his commandments and no one else's when it contradicts his. All right, so these are the first 5 of the 13 principles of our faith. And we'll finish here for today. And our next class will already deal with prophecy and the prophecy of Moshe and the revelation from God and the Torah coming from God. Any questions on today's class? All right, perfect. It was well understood. Anyone wants to delve deeper into this topic? This is one class that covered maybe 3 or 4 lectures in one of the previous courses. All jumped into one class. All right, so Erev Tov, everybody.
Thank you
And
so much.
we'll see you. Is there a class next week? Bracha or
Thank
after
you.
Hanukkah?
Yes, next week, yes. First
Next week.
half the Shabbat Tov, yeah? We will see you.